Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Seds Online webinar. This week we're going to be having an instructional webinar from Peir and we're really pleased to introduce him. We're really excited this week as well because yesterday we hit 2,000 members of Seds Online, so that's really powerful stuff. We've got a fantastic community of sedimentologists out there, so we're really pleased to have every single one of you. We're also giving thanks to the International Association of Sedimentologists, the IAS, because without their funding we wouldn't be able to do these results for free. So thank you very much again to you guys. So to introduce our speaker for the week, Peir Pufahl is from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Peir is a professor of sedimentology and geochemistry, and he co-directs the facility for isotope research at Queen's University. Peir is going to present an instructional webinar for us today on how to survive a review or how to approach a review. His presentation is based on 15 years experience as an editor. He is presently editor-in-chief for sedimentology. We really look forward to your valuable advice, Peir, and so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. I appreciate the introduction. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the two other chief editors of sedimentology, Giovanna Della Porta and Ian Kane. It's three of us that are the chief editors of the journal. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge previous editors of the journal, people like Nigel Mountney and Tracy Frank, who really started this style of talk. And so myself, Giovanna, and Ian have really added to these talks as to how to approach a review, how to write a good paper. So the kernel of this talk really lies at their feet, and we've just expanded on it. Now, before I kind of delve into the talk, a shameless plug for, let me advance here. There we go. Already a technical issue. There we go. A shameless plug for sedimentology, just a really quick overview of the journal as to why folks might like to publish in the journal. It's got a relatively high impact factor, rapid publication, final decisions take about 30 days from the point of submission to when we render a CE decision or chief editor decision. Articles go online immediately to early view, and final print versions of those in early view normally are published within 6 months. It's a high quality product, free color figures, no real hard page limits or word limits, and it's a highly visible journal with over 4,000 institutions subscribing, and we have Wiley backing us so we can rely on their marketing and author services. And for our sister journal, the Depositional Record, which is a relatively new open access journal, which is really making some waves, so to speak, in the community, it has a slightly different scope. It focuses on sedimentary processes in the depositional record and the application of the depositional record to the study of geobiology, sedimentology, geochemistry, and earth evolution. Now, I mentioned this, that it's our open access and online journal. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is that all open access fees are paid by the IAS. So there's no cost to you for open access publication. And I mentioned it's a relatively new journal. Its first issue was in June 2015. There's over 95 articles now with 291 citations. They'll be applying for an ISI impact factor next year. And when that happens, the estimated impact factor will be about 2.3. And they also have, like sedimentology, high editorial standards. So just two journals to consider putting your work into as you move forward in your careers. All right, now onto the talk. And so when I kind of put this talk together with my colleagues, we're focusing kind of towards the end on how to handle a negative review, but we thought it would be probably more advantageous to talk about the whole submission process in general, so you can kind of subvert a potential negative review by doing a number of things that go into putting together a good paper, and then once that paper comes back from the chief editor with their decision, so then how do you handle that review? So what I'd like to talk about first is journal publishing in general. So when we think about the ideal submission to really any journal, there are a few key points to keep in mind that go into a good paper. First of all, you want to make sure that your purpose is adequately justified and that the research questions or aims are absolutely clear. It really does come down to what is the question you're asking and how broad of the scope and impact that your work will make. And that has to be crystal clear in the abstract and in the introduction, and you have to keep coming back to that point, and especially in the conclusion when you conclude your paper. Thinking in terms of the body of the manuscript or the paper, are the methods appropriate? Are they robust? Are they competent? Is there a clear distinction between data and interpretation? This point is incredibly important. All right, we want to keep our descriptions, for example, of lithofaces completely separate from their interpretations so that the reader themselves can determine the quality of the interpretation separate from the data. Is the manuscript in point 5 data rich with adequate evidence, and is it clearly written and presented? And we've touched on this point already. Is the subject of broad generic importance? Is it internationally appealing? This last point here of international appeal is more important for some journals than others. For sedimentology, this is a prerequisite for publication in the journal. And does the paper contain novel elements, such as the aims, methods, and the implications of the research, so that the outcomes are non-trivial? Is it an important advance in the discipline? Now, all of these points are expanded upon in an editorial that was published in 2011 within Sedimentology that kind of outline these points in more detail and really highlight what goes into a really good sedimentology paper. And this was written by Peter Swart, another chief editor, past chief editor of the journal. So I think one of the most important points when you think collectively about how to write a good paper, aside from the question that you're asking, of course, the interpretations must be supported by data. And I turn your attention here to the cartoon. Here we've got a big hole with the data and the conclusion. Eating milk chocolate will make you look younger and thinner. Look, half the work is done. All you need to do is fill in the top part so we can legally say the bottom part. Right? You need to make sure that your interpretations and conclusions are completely supported by the data that you're presenting. All right, so what are some of the problems that might, that some papers suffer from that lead to a more negative review than you might like? Well, one of them is it lacks contextualization and or too parochial or local. So the work may be of regional interest, but it's insufficiently contextualized within a broader set of academic questions or issues. So what generic questions or debates of broad interest does this paper address? What can someone working elsewhere gain from your work? Why do your results matter? So really this question comes down to who cares? Why would someone care about the work that you're presenting? Other issues, poor presentation, English might be an issue, the structure of the manuscript and illustrations might be poorly drawn. All of these things like regarding poor presentation really affect logic, flow, and clarity. Point 3 here, facts and interpretations are not distinguished from one another. We've talked about that. Lacks data sufficient to support the arguments. We've also touched on that. And a long, uninformative title and abstract. The title is critical as well to your paper. You can have the best paper if you choose the wrong title. That initial hook, which gets your readers interested, might allow your work to go unnoticed. So really think about what title you're going to tag on to your paper. It should be short and pithy and informative. All right, so moving on, looking at some ethical issues, not just when you construct or write a paper, but also when you review a paper. So of course there's plagiarism, and I think we're all pretty well aware of plagiarism and even self-plagiarism, work that you might have conducted in the past and you don't appropriately reference your own self. Redundant publishing or shingling. And I hate to say it, but this point 2, is becoming more apparent and more, I think, visible and more common. And that's when, of course, when you take a paper that you've published, you tweak a little bit, and someone submits it to another journal so that it can count as an additional publication, which is really frowned upon when shingling is noticed in the discipline. Misappropriation of data. Taking someone else's data without permission, passing it off as your own, or misusing it. Resubmitting rejected work. No, look, it's okay to resubmit a rejected paper to another journal as long as you disclose that information to the chief editor of the journal that you're resubmitting the work to. And sometimes it's even useful to highlight how you've changed that work. But taking a paper that was rejected and just simply submitting it to another journal is frowned upon. And of course, number 5, fabrication and falsification of data and inappropriate authorship. So for a more expanded list of publishing criteria and good publishing practices, I really encourage you to go to this website here, which focuses on information that the Committee on Publishing Ethics has, or COPE, and it's free, and that offers excellent advice for authors, reviewers, and editors. So once you've completed your paper, all the ethical issues and such have been satisfied and the paper's in good standing, let's have a look now at the process, because I think, especially for early career researchers, that the process of how a paper moves through the review process is a little bit like a black box and can be a bit daunting, and it shouldn't be. So here's a nice flow chart that shows what happens to your manuscript after it arrives, really, in any editorial office. At sedimentology and the depositional record, we have a fairly rigorous pre-screening process. All right, sometimes this process is more rigorous in some journals than others, but when a paper comes across my desk, I read it, and there's certain questions I ask. Is the research important? Is it novel, significant? Is it too local in scope? What's the general or generic scientific significance of that paper? And then if it passes those questions, then we forward it to an associate editor who then handles the review process. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when submitting to journals, and specifically a sedimentology, 30% of our papers are rejected at this stage, all right, through this pre-screening process. And even those papers that are rejected, we try to offer constructive criticisms so that if the author wishes to resubmit to our journal or another one, they have some positive comments or feedback that they can utilize to make the paper better. Once the paper's passed to the associate editor may ask some of those same questions, and ultimately then that paper is farmed out to peer reviewers that basically review that paper. The reviews come back to the associate editor. The associate editor makes their recommendation to the chief editor, and then that allows the chief editor then to make a decision whether that paper is accepted with revision or rejected. Now, it should be noted, almost all papers undergo at least one round of revision. It's very rare for a paper to be accepted outright through this process. So when we think about peer review, all right, and how a review is generated, what's the definition of a peer review? It's a formal system whereby a piece of academic work is scrutinized by people who were not involved in its creation, but are considered knowledgeable about the subject. Okay. So these are other experts in the field that can contribute possibly to the science by critiquing your work. Now, how are reviewers chosen, right? Another kind of black box that folks might not be aware as to how those reviewers are chosen. From a list of experts suggested by the submitting authors. Almost all journals require this. This helps the associate editor, and in some cases the chief editor, pick professionals and experts from the field. Researchers who previously investigated the topic or geographic area. Again, another form of expertise. From the reference list of the submitted paper. This helps the associate editor and chief editor kind of narrow that list down through a database or web search of the topic using keywords. And at always of prime importance as we're seeking out reviewers, we want to avoid reviewers that have a possible conflict of interest, whether that's a personal conflict of interest or whether they've published together too recently, or whether they're direct competitors, all right? And so we work very, very hard to ensure that our reviewers are not in a conflict of interest when asked. So the reviewers, all right? If you're a reviewer, and all of us are going to be reviewers at one point in our careers, I think the key word here is integrity, right? You want to be honest, you want to be consistent, you want to be reliable, you want to be trustworthy, competent, sincere. You truly want to help that author that submitted that paper. And so a negative review, in my opinion, really isn't a negative review if it's honest and makes the paper better, right? And so that's our job as reviewers, And I'll take it a step further, and I make this point later on in the talk, that we shouldn't write anything down that we're afraid to sign our name to, right? That goes hand in hand with integrity. So I think the best reviews are all those things that I just mentioned here across these fingers, but you should also be willing to sign your name to it. So reviewers, I mentioned this before, reviewers are expert and are those researchers that are most knowledgeable. They're colleagues. We're all reviewers. The most knowledgeable reviewers might not be available to perform the review. That happens a lot. In fact, one of the frustrations today is that it's getting harder and harder to find reviewers and obtain detailed, thorough reviews as we become busier and busier. And as more journals are born with time, it's just more difficult to find good reviewers. And so one of the things to keep in mind when you submit a paper is that good reviews, because they rely on good reviewers, take time to prepare a balanced and thoughtful review. And so it might take longer than you anticipate to get that review back, but sometimes it's worth waiting for because those comments from the reviewers are really going to help your manuscript. So, getting to the heart, I guess, of this talk, making the revisions and dealing with the reviews once they're back from the associate editor and chief editor. Now, I think the first point here is an important one. Change the manuscript in the ways requested. Okay. What I do when I receive a review is I read it, I put it aside, I sleep on it for a day or so, and I come back to it. Because none of us like to hear what we perceive to be negative comments about our work, because we poured our heart and soul into the manuscript and into the science. And sometimes it's tough to stomach and digest. But read it, put it away for a day, come back to it with kind of with open eyes and really take to heart what those comments have said. And what you want to do then in answering the review comments is to produce a document that explains in details the changes made. That in itself takes a long time sometimes, because you basically have to build a case as to why you have or have not made certain revisions. In a sense, what you have to become is a bit of a lawyer, right? And you have to pose closing arguments, so to speak, and they have to be well-argued arguments. And it's okay to argue back to the co-editor, the associate editor and the chief editor, because sometimes we do make mistakes. We're human too. So rebuttal is certainly okay, but sometimes those comments that were made really do suggest that the manuscript does need to be changed in some ways to add clarity. Otherwise, the readers and the chief editor and the associate editors wouldn't have made their mistakes and maybe misinterpreting certain things. And one of the cardinal rules here is don't play reviewers off one another. Every opinion matters, and usually more difficult review comments to deal with can be made by just being honest, forthright, and building those arguments by producing that well-detailed document upon resubmission. So a few golden rules when responding to reviews, and especially when you're first starting out and this whole process is a bit new. Don't be afraid to ask the chief editor and associate editor questions. We really are there to help you guys get your papers published in top-notch journals. So if something is unclear in the decision letter, in the associate editor comments, or even in the review comments, just fire an email to us, ask us, and we'll do our best to clarify those issues. And number two here, it is the understanding of the reader at this stage, reviewers and editors, that matters, not your perspective as the author. This is a tough one because ultimately, again, like I mentioned, it's really hard sometimes to receive negative feedback or what's perceived as negative feedback. But this is where you really need to digest, let that information sit and come back to it, and then pick those comments apart and say, you know what, I can make this change. It'll actually make it a better paper. Or I disagree with this comment here, but I can deal with that in this way. And I think the really important point here comes down to point 3, is that really overcome self-pity and annoyance, respond completely, politely, and with evidence. This is where sleeping on it for 1 or 2 nights is important. If you do get some negative feedback, remember that point 4 here really hammers this point home, is that a negative review or negative feedback should not be considered a personal attack. It's simply a comment on the science. And like I said, a good review is really aimed at improving the overall quality of the science so you have the best publication possible. All right, so once you've made your revisions, once you've drafted your covering letter appropriately to really respond to all of those review comments, you resubmit it, right? And so you resubmit it, it kind of goes through the same screening process, and usually it's fired right back to the associate editor that handled the review process, and it's checked for those revisions. If it has to be sent back out for further revision and review, it usually goes back. We try to send it back to at least one of the same reviewers. In the event that minor, in some cases moderate revisions were requested, the associate and chief editors can handle that and basically review for completeness to make sure that those revisions were done appropriately before making a final decision. So not every resubmitted manuscript goes back out for re-review, but I would say 50 to 60% of them actually do. And then a decision is rendered, it's accepted, you receive your page proofs, and then eventually it's published, either online or in hard copy format. So the review itself, right? The review itself. So what makes a good review? Okay, we've talked about how to handle a review, how to handle negative comments. Well, as I mentioned before, we're all reviewers. And I think it's really our duty, if we're submitting papers to journals to be published, we really need to review papers from time to time. It's how our system works. It's based on the honor system, and it's a volunteer-based system. And if we don't review papers, that problem of trying to find reviewers for all of our work becomes increasingly difficult. But what makes a good review? A good review evaluates the work, not the person, in the context of the journal's objective. It provides objective comments, taking into account and declaring any conflict of interest, knowledge, limitation, etc. A good review is on time, polite, and accurate. Now, extenuating circumstances can certainly happen. Just email the chief editor. 9 times out of 10, we're more than happy to grant an extension because you know, people's lives are complicated, especially now under the conditions we're operating under. And so just email us if it's going to take longer than anticipated. A good review contains understandable comments that are clearly linked to the text, right? So if you make a comment in a review where more work is needed or something is unclear, cite a line number or a paragraph number or key phrases within the text. And I think 5 is a really important point here, that when we make comments, we're really aiming to improve the overall quality and impact of the manuscript. We're on your side, so to speak, as a reviewer. We want to see this work published for the most part, in most cases, and we want to do our best to make sure that the work is most impactful as possible. And I've already mentioned this point, number 6, that a good review is signed by the reviewer itself, because we shouldn't be saying anything that we're afraid to sign our name to. So we don't necessarily want to submit anonymous reviews. So a negative review, right? Just a few keywords about what happens when we truly get one of those negative reviews. Just keep in mind that everyone who publishes has had papers rejected, right? You're not the only one that this has happened to. Sometimes it's tough when you're first starting out to appreciate that, but we've all had papers rejected, and for the most part, taking that criticism to heart, we've become better scientists because of it, and our papers are better because of it. And I've mentioned this a couple times too, but calm down, go to the bar and relax, sleep on it before responding, come back to it the next day or in a couple days, and reevaluate what those comments really said. Remember, this isn't a personal attack. These comments are meant to improve the quality of your science. So then read the review comments carefully, linking them to your text. And, you know, one of the things to keep in mind that rereading your manuscript, sometimes after 2 months of your paper being in the review process, after submission, you might forget certain key points. In fact, it might be to the point where you want to scream after having to go back to the manuscript and make further changes. And you might ask yourself, boy, did I really write that? Is that what I was thinking about? Was I in a rush when I wrote that? Did I actually mean this? What did I really want to say here? Because if a reviewer is confused, then you might need to add some clarity. And why did I miss that key publication? Well, that's why we have our papers reviewed, right? Many times if it goes to another expert, they can help us hone in on key literature that we might have missed. So then think about, the process itself and what goes into that review. Someone, at least 2 reviewers, 1 associate editor, 1 chief editor, has invested time, several hours to days, to read and comment on your paper for free. So they must not be too bad at people. Then ask yourself, what are the reasons for the negative review? Are they all insane, or does my manuscript actually have flaws that can be improved upon? And it's probably the latter here, right? That your manuscript can be improved upon, and that's certainly the way you should approach that review. Now, in reality, when taken in the correct light, a negative review might not be that negative, because a careful and thoughtful revision of your manuscript will produce a much stronger and impactful publication. All right, just hammering that point home that we've connected with a few times throughout this talk. Now, I'm happy to take questions, and I've also got a few or 2 slides after this slide to kind of prime the audience if we're not getting any questions. It's some questions that I can just throw to you guys. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Peir. That was always useful information to know, especially the advice about going and taking a breather for a minute or 2.
Always important.
Always important. So whilst our audience is typing questions into the chat, I just want to remind anybody who's watching this on the recording that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So please find the thread in the forums, and we can connect you to Peir to make sure that your questions get answered there.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we're just waiting. We have opened the chat for questions. Fantastic. Stephen wants to know, are chief and associate editors paid?
No, we're not. For the most part, journals look at these positions as volunteered positions, and we're more than happy to do that. I personally look at it as service back to the community that supported me when I first started out, and I just think that these kinds of ways to pay the community back are incredibly important, but they're not paid.
All in good faith then.
Absolutely.
We have a question from Aaron saying, is being a chief editor more or less a full-time job on top of your real full-time job?
I wouldn't say that it's a full-time job. I look at it as a part-time job, 2 to 3 days a week, to do a good job being a chief editor. One of the things that I suggest, as a early career researcher, or for early career researchers, is just try to get onto an editorial board after being in your position for a couple years, and so you can kind of test drive the system, see how it works. But don't take on a chief editorship until you're more firmly established in your career, because it does take significant amount of time. But that said, when you're more established, you can go to your department head and ask, can I have a reduction in my service to the university, or may I have a reduction in teaching? And most departments are happy to oblige, because they know what workload's associated with being a chief editor. And they also know that it brings certain cachet to the department and the institution, especially if the journal is a high profile journal. So yes, it takes time. I wouldn't do it too early in your career. Later on in your career, it's certainly a worthwhile endeavor, and concessions can be made so that you can do it and do it well.
Could you advise on how many years into your career? Because the boundary from career to mid-career varies.
I would say maybe 8 to 10 years just to give yourself time to establish your own research path with your own research group. And that allows you to build your own personal cachet up in the discipline, so that you have the network and the breadth to be a chief editor. But cutting your teeth as an associate editor for good journals is a perfect way to start that process, and also to give back to the discipline. And the other point that I didn't make in the talk, but when you're an associate editor or a chief editor, you get the privilege to read a lot of amazing science. And so one of the things that I love about the position is that, I learn a lot, right? As a chief editor and as an associate editor, and you really get a feel for who's doing what and who's doing the outstanding work, and it's really rewarding from that perspective.
Great. We've had some thank yous through for you as well, and the questions are starting to come in now.
Oh, good.
So we have a question from Juan saying, this is a hypothetical question. If a manuscript receives 3 reviews, 2 accept and 1 reject, how would you handle this situation as an editor?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that actually comes up more often than you might think. And I'll take it a step further and say, you know, typically we want at least 2 reviews for any paper. We usually cast a net that's broader than that. We might invite 4 or 5 people, knowing that people are busy. What that does is it expedites the review process, because we're not, you know, sending emails out 2-3 weeks after we accept a paper. So the hope is we get at least 2 reviewers, better if we get 3. Now, quite often the reviews are split, right? So you either have one that says that it should be accepted with minor revisions, and another might say it's rejected. If you only have 2 reviews and it's a split decision like that, I always seek out a 3rd reviewer, always, to help me with my decision, so that whatever decision I am making is unbiased and I think is as fair as possible. Now, if you get 3 reviews where you've got 2 accept or minor revisions and then 1 reject, we read every manuscript that we get, so we can assess the quality of the science, and for the most part, if it's close to our expertise, so we can also help judge based on those split decisions, so to speak. But in a case where you've got 2 minor revisions and 1 reject, I would always err on the side of acceptance with minor to moderate revisions, and encourage the author to address as many comments as they can with that more negative review, because that's going to make it a better paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other point I want to make, actually, and someone might ask this, if you're an early career scientist and you're just starting out and you're you know, PhD level, postdoc level, you know, we really do try to go that extra mile with our review comments when we make decisions on manuscripts to help you. You know, and I look at, you know, that's a very important part of our job as a chief editor. It's not just to accept or reject manuscripts, but it's to kind of nurture the future of the discipline. And in doing that, you know, I wouldn't say extra time, but maybe more care in the way we write our decision letters, so that we can provide more constructive feedback to those early career scientists to help them get a stronger footing and foundation as they're moving forward in their careers, so that they can then, you know, hopefully achieve a higher degree of success with the next round of submissions.
Great. We have a question from Ahmed saying, how much time should a paper take to get published in general?
Well, that's another good question, and a lot depends on the journal. You know, so I think an ideal situation, you submit a paper, all the reviews come back within 3 to 4 weeks. Most journals have a 3 to 4 week deadline for the reviews, and if that goes smoothly, the CE decision, the chief editor's decision should be made within a day or 2 of receiving the associate editor's decision. So we're looking at 4 to 5 weeks, absolute tops. You know, I mean, at the most minimal amount of time is 4 to 5 weeks. It might take 6-7 weeks if reviews are coming back slowly. Then after that paper is accepted, you know, if it doesn't have to go out for re-revisions or re-review, there's the whole editing process with their editorial assistants and editorial managers. So that's something I didn't really touch on, which adds time. And each journal touches on that and deals with that in a very different way. So I can only really comment on sedimentology, but we have 2 people in our office, as does the depositional record. They have 1 dedicated person that once your paper is accepted, they manually go through your manuscript with a fine-tooth comb, looking for spelling, grammatical errors, you know, maybe disconnects between figure captions in the text and how it's cited. I'm going to say that not all journals do that to that degree, but we're focused on producing the best possible product for you at the end. That adds time. It doesn't add significant time, but it adds time that's sometimes noticeable in relation to other journals that have a more automated process. So from that point of acceptance to that editing process might add another 2 to 3 weeks. And then once it's finally accepted, it goes to early view. So in an ideal world, and speaking in the context of sedimentology, from submission to acceptance to early view might be 2 months. But in reality, it's probably more like 2.5 to 3. But one of the things to keep in mind, from the point that you submit a paper to sedimentology to a final decision in that first submission is only 30 days. So we're well within that 4-week window that I talked about. I know that's a convoluted answer, but it's not an easy answer because it's so journal specific.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. That helps a lot, actually, knowing behind the scenes. Really helps.
Yeah, that whole behind the scenes thing, it does often, and it's often regarded as this black box, like what really happens. There really are people trained to look at your manuscript, again, to help you with not only the science, but also the presentation of it. So that you can have a paper when it's published in a high profile journal that it looks the best and it's the best quality possible. And that human touch takes time and energy. And sometimes you just can't speed that up.
Great. Our next question is from Valentin, saying, cheers, Peir. Nice to hear from chief editors. Quick question. What to do when the chief editor of the journal threatens you to block your paper to be published, post-revision, accepted by reviewers and associate editor, unless you cite his unpublished paper?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Is this Val?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there another chief editor? Most journals have more than one chief editor now, and to handle the ever increasing rise in submissions. So what I would do is go to the other chief editor, if one exists, and ask for some advice and clarity. And if it's a society journal, you can even go to their, lodge a complaint with in our case, the IS. We have a bureau, or there's got to be some kind of overarching organization or committee that basically oversees their journal publications. And that's for society journals. If it's one of the big publishers that isn't a society journal, I think that's a little bit more difficult. But my first stop would be to try to reach out to another CE and get some perspective, especially a CE from that journal.
Good advice. Next question is from Haseen, saying, thanks, Peir. Sorry, my question is a bit far from the topic. I have my thesis manuscript. 1 chapter is already published, 2 in prep. Is it a good idea to not put online my thesis yet until it's all published, or does it really not matter?
I don't really think it matters. I mean, once something's published, it's in the public domain, so to speak, right? One thing you do have to keep in mind, that if you're working with companies, you might have to sign non-disclosure agreements. There might be a blackout or embargo on data that can be shown to the public. So those are the most important things I'd be mindful of. But if it's all publicly funded research and you've already published a paper, I don't think there should be any hesitation in posting it online in a public repository of some kind. But most theses are, once they're finished anyways, right? They're in an institutional repository that's freely accessible to the general public anyways.
Great. Our next question's from Abdullah. Thanks a lot. What is the chance of accepting a manuscript of a regional context in an international journal?
Small. Yeah, I'm just being honest, small. In an international journal, if you can take that local project or research that's local in scope and demonstrate its broad applicability to other areas, or that it's addressing an overarching question that might have kind of dogged science for several years or decades, yeah, that's absolutely appropriate. But you can have a local study, you just have to demonstrate its generic scientific significance to the community. And so, to be honest with you, when we pre-screen, that's sometimes the biggest comment, the most common comment that we make is, it's not that it's bad science, it's just that there are more appropriate journals for publishing kind of parochial or more local in scope work. And if you ever get a response or a decision like that, again, keep in mind that it's not a negative comment on the science, right? And we try to make that very clear. It just doesn't fit the remit of the journal that you might have submitted it to.
Great. A question from Ahmed. Is it better to have more than 2 authors in order to get a paper published, i.e. by having a famous name in the area of the study, even though their contributions may be minimal?
No. And in fact, journals are becoming more scrupulous as we analyze author lists, right? And for the most part, you've got to be able to justify and explain what contributions each author has basically imparted on the manuscript. So it actually, I think, does you a disservice to just tag people on as authors if they really haven't made a meaningful contribution. And this comes down to the integrity piece, right? Not just the integrity of a reviewer, but an integrity of as an author. And I know when you're kind of first starting out as an early career scientist, it can be daunting, it can be frustrating. And the best advice I can give you is stick with it, stick true to the science, and always operate with the highest degree of integrity, because in the long run, that's what's going to win. And you just want to be honest from the get-go when you submit a paper. And you know what I say to my students in my group, I say, at the end of the day, you have to be able to sleep at night. And if you can sleep at night with the decisions you've made and feel good about it, that's really all that matters, right? And that's something to always keep in mind.
Good life advice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be honest, right? I fully believe that. And you always have
Absolutely.
to operate with the highest degree of integrity in whatever we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Jagby wants to know, how is the impact factor of the journal calculated?
I'm just going to wipe my nose here, allergies. Basically what they do, there's a 2-year and a 5-year impact factor. They look at all of the papers that were published over those set time periods, and they look at how many of those papers were cited. So it's basically looking at the number of papers that had numerous citations versus those that might not have been as well cited. And so it's almost a ratio. It's a way of calculating how many citations were made over a specific period of time. And with sedimentology, you'll notice that our impact factor is about 3.2, which is ranked 4th out of 47 geology journals. So for sedimentary geology, that's pretty darn good. But if you look at our 5-year impact factor, it's about 3.8. So what that means, of course, like most papers in sedimentology, they take a long time to write, right? I mean, you go out into the field, you collect data, you look down a microscope, you might get some geochemistry, you might need to collect some geophysical data. But our papers in our discipline generally take a long time to bring to fruition, right? It's not just gathering data and putting a quick publication out. There's a lot of description that goes into our papers. And I think that's also seen in our impact factor. We have a very good impact factor over 2 years, but it increases substantially over that 5-year period, because it takes not only a long time for those papers to come out when we produce them, but because that whole process takes a while, but it takes a bit of time for a lot of these seminal papers to gain traction. And we see that with that increase in that 5-year impact factor.
Excellent. Question from Daniel. Thank you for this very illustrative talk. What happens when a reviewer is biased by his or her specialty and is asking for more information on aspects or data that were not measured or done during the research, which in fact do not add further value to the purpose of the paper? Is this a reason to reject a paper?
No, I don't think so. And that happens a lot in our reviews, and that's where the associate editor and chief editors, we read all the reviews, especially as chief editor. We've reviewed the paper ourselves. So, our job is to take maybe some biased reviews, and a lot of the bias is just unknown bias, right? When a reviewer is reading something, I think we all suffer from this, is that we read something from the perspective of our specialty, and we might miss important things. And that's certainly why we want more than one reviewer to review all manuscripts. And so I think if you have a number of reviews, the CE's done their job, they'll produce a balanced decision based on all the information at hand. And you're certainly within your right, like I said in my talk, to say, you know what, I really don't agree with this review. and do it politely and say, here's why. Build your case. This is where you have to become a lawyer and say, you know what, we've done this, this, and this. This is really enough to show what we're interpreting and why it's important. This really doesn't add much to it if we were to do this, and it really needs to be the focus of another paper. That's completely justified, right? And so I would approach it in that way.
Great, thank you. A question from Yako. Thanks, Peir. What is your view on authors identifying opposed reviewers? Reasons, how many?
Yeah, another great question, Yako. It seems that those opposed reviewer lists are growing and growing as submitting authors are trying to, I think, insulate themselves to some degree from those negative reviews. I always, warning bells go off when I see a long list of opposed reviewers. One or two, I think, are often justified because, you know, at times you might have a personal conflict with somebody. And of course, you don't want to have any reviewer or invite a reviewer that has a personal conflict of interest, or, you know, to be more pointed, an axe to grind with that certain individual. We want the science to prevail. We don't want to attack people. But I think, you know, in a nutshell, I think a long list of opposed reviewers, like I mentioned, warning bells should be going off in one's head. But I think one or two are probably realistic and justified in some cases. But, you know, that said, for those of you that are thinking of submitting a paper, if there's somebody that really either doesn't like you or, you know, is just completely, in a sense, diametrically opposed to your results and how you've interpreted them, by all means, put them down, but you have to justify it. You just can't put somebody down and say, I just don't want them to review it. You need to justify why that person might be inappropriate to review your paper.
Okay. Next question is from Chelsea. Thanks for the nice talk, Peir. I was wondering what a typical max or minimum number of manuscripts each associate editor handles each year at Sedimentology.
Yeah, so I guess, enjoyed a never increasing number of submissions annually, so that we're well over 300 submissions a year now. And with the pandemic, and I suspect more time people have had in some cases to write, we're on track to basically acquire about 330 or 340 submissions this year, which will be a record. And so that said, what we've tried to do over the past 3 to 4 years is expand our editorial board, our board of associate editors, so that we have more people with certain expertise. And I'm looking here at Yako because he's one of our stalwarts as far as our associate editors go. He seems to always have more papers than everybody else. And we've worked really hard at trying to find other people in his discipline to lessen his load. But what we aim to do is to try to assign each associate editor 12 to 14 papers a year, which basically amounts to 1 paper a month. Now, certain associate editors, that hasn't been the case, but we're certainly working hard to do that. The other important point that I want to make is we've expanded our editorial board. We've worked very hard to achieve more gender balance, equity in our AE board, so that we have truly more global representation. And so with that, an invitation, if you're interested in becoming an associate editor and you're at that point in your career where you'd like to kind of, you know, ping us and see if we have any openings, you know, I encourage you guys to email me or one of the other chief editors. And at the very minimum, we could put your name on a list, if not for an associate editor position right away, but we've got a running list of reviewers of people that have specific expertise. And we try to reach out to those, and you wouldn't believe how helpful that is. And so, yeah, I think that answers it, and then probably then some.
Great, thank you. Question from Alec. Does the process of editing change if the author informs the chief editor that the submission has been rejected from a different journal?
Nope, absolutely not. Especially if they can demonstrate that they've made revisions and they've taken those previous review comments to heart, and they're upfront about it. So when we think about conflict of interest, integrity, there's one word that really surfaces in all these cases, and that's honesty. and transparency. You will never go wrong if you're honest and transparent, right? Problems start to exist if you submit a paper and a reviewer says, hey, I've seen this paper before and it's really not changed that much. Then the warning sign bells go off and then there's a problem. But if you're open, transparent, and honest right from the get-go, your paper will be treated just like any other paper.
Great. Question from Nabil. Any recommendations to write a strong introduction?
Yeah, that's another great question. What's the question? That's the question that needs to be answered. What's the question? Why is it important? And what impact will the science make? All of that has to be packaged into the introduction. And when I talk to students and postdocs in my group, we always talk about, okay, what's the question here? What are we really trying to answer and why is it important? If your introduction can do that, you've got a great introduction. And often the shorter the introduction, the more impactful it might be, because there's less text for the reader to wade through as you're building your case. And so again, short introductions that answer that question and demonstrate the importance, that's my advice for writing a good introduction. Not only a good introduction, but a good abstract as well.
Great. Next question is from Zhang. Thank you, Peir. One question: what we need to do when a manuscript was turned off by more than one journal, how do we estimate it and submit it to a new journal?
A good question. I think it's a case where collectively you look at the review comments, take them to heart, and number one, ask yourself, were you following the advice of the previous reviewers? Were you submitting your work to journals that might not have been the best fit? In some cases, it's a tough pill to swallow when you get advice that said, you know what, this is pretty good work, but it's really not of this stature. It's not under the remit of, say, a journal like Science or Nature. Maybe submit it to a more regional journal or a journal that specializes in this, or a more discipline specific journal. Sometimes that's a tough pill to swallow. And so I would take the review comments to heart, really evaluate where you're submitting it, and look for a more appropriate journal, probably. But that's a tough question to answer without actually seeing the review comments and providing specific advice.
Thanks. We have a question from Ahmed. He's asking, do you take it into consideration if it's someone's first paper?
Yeah, a lot of times we can tell. We've got a pretty savvy bunch once the papers come in. Sometimes we do Google searches. We do ORCID searches just to get some context sometimes. And especially if the paper looks like a data dump from a thesis, which is you don't want to do. And sometimes the paper can be long and structured more like a thesis. In those cases, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it's important. When you're first starting out, that guidance, those comments are important. That doesn't mean that the decision is lenient. That means, any more lenient than we would be or approaching our decisions, an early career scientist versus one that's been in the business for 30 to 40 years. The decision will always be the same, and it should be, but we will spend extra time providing that feedback and constructive criticism to make that paper better when you're first starting out. And we kind of pride ourselves in that and do spend a lot of time and energy trying to do that for those early career people.
Great stuff. Next question is from Joanna, and she's asking, is the number of submitted articles recently increasing or decreasing, or does the current situation have no effect on that?
Yeah, it's increasing, probably by 15, maybe 20% over the last 3.5 months. It's been a challenge, right? And so for those of you that might have submitted papers, especially now, we appreciate your patience as we're juggling many more publications or submissions than we have. It's kind of a good problem to have, but the other thing I want to say is that we're also very mindful of people's working conditions, working from home, juggling 2 career households. People are home with kids. things take longer. And I think, you know, the patience that the community has certainly shown us, and that includes the submitting authors, we very much appreciate. And I think when you submit a paper, just know that those timelines that I mentioned, you know, how quick we can go to a final decision after submission and such, we're trying to meet those marks right now, but the reality, like everything else, are taking a little bit longer as we move through this pandemic. But, you know, and that's compounded by the fact we're getting more submissions. So I think yesterday, Elaine Richardson, our journal manager, said to me, we're already at almost 170 submissions since January. And that's up about 40 to 50 submissions over the same time period last year. Yeah.
Something to bear in mind.
Yeah. Remember, this is a volunteer position.
Yeah. Next question's from Yuri, saying, thanks, Peir. How do you differentiate roles of the first author and the correspondence author?
Oh, yeah, another great question. So usually the corresponding author is the author that put the paper together, that, you know, wrote it and basically took the helm through the whole writing and production process of the manuscript. Now, in some cases, if you're a student and your whereabouts will be unknown after you finish the paper and your degree, if you're not going to be tied to an institution or a permanent email address, sometimes, and I've done this with my students, just so that if there are inquiries that, you know, somebody that is interested in the work can basically contact a permanent person. Sometimes as a supervisor, you might be the corresponding author, even though you might not be the first author. But the bottom line is, whether that's the case or not, the first author is the one that has pulled the entire paper together, right? And has seen it from start to finish. So I wouldn't worry so much about corresponding author, especially if you're going to be kind of mobile. But if you're in that permanent position or you're moving to a more or less permanent postdoc, it's probably more appropriate that you as first author be that corresponding author.
Great. I think this is our last question from Ahmed, asking, do you have any recommendations for proofreading a manuscript, so any useful softwares?
No, not so much software. You need a human touch. You need someone who's a native English speaker or very proficient in English to review it. That said, more journal or more publishing houses, including Wiley, have writing help that you can pay for, English language services that you can pay for. And the one comment I have about those services, some of them are very good, but you need to use an English language service that is specific to science, right? Because the technical writing in a paper like you would submit to sedimentology, the depositional record, sedimentary geology, JSR, is very different than the kind of language you would use in a sociology journal. And so if you need that kind of technical help, you can't rely on software. If you don't have a colleague or a friend who's proficient in English, I think the best bet is to seek out one of these language services, keeping in mind it has to be one that's oriented to science, or better yet, the discipline that you're submitting to.
Right. That's always the problem with saying the last question. Two more questions come in.
All right.
No, yeah. So we have a question from Juan who says, is there any difference in terms of scope and review process among these three journals: Sedimentology, Sedimentary Geology, and Journal of Sedimentary Research?
No, you know, the review process between JSR and sedimentology, I think, is fairly similar. And it's also pretty similar in sedimentary geology. Sedimentary geology, the chief editors, for the most part, handle the whole review process. And they use their associate editor board to basically provide those high caliber reviews. And so I think, and I don't want to misspeak here, but I'm almost certain that the associate editors are viewed more like expert reviewers versus those that, you know, in sedimentology, they handle the review process on behalf of the chief editor. I think those are the main differences, but ultimately the decision comes from the chief editor. of all three of those journals, taking into account the reviews and all the other information that all three of those, I call them the top three or the big three, right, in our discipline. That decision-making process is almost identical. How we get to that point might be a little bit different in how we collect their information, but that decision-making process is very similar.
Question from Adrian. Following Joanna's question, except from Corona times, are there seasonal peaks in manuscript submissions? For example, after major conferences, EGU, AGU, and does this affect the chance of acceptance?
No, it doesn't affect your chance at all. I mean, every manuscript is treated as a single entity as it goes through that review process. It might be more difficult to find reviewers, but we're pretty steadfast and relentless in trying to secure those high quality reviews. We do see lulls, and the biggest lull usually occurs kind of in the summer when everybody's in the field, right? And so and then we see kind of a spike September, October, when everybody comes back and has their data in hand and have, got the data they need to finish that manuscript that may have started before the field season. We do see a little bit, a little bump depending on where summer is in the northern and southern hemisphere at times, but in general, the northern hemisphere summer is our slower time.
Not this year.
Not this year. It's going to continue to rise. Well, then eventually people are going to run out of things to write about, right? If they can't get into the field. But I don't know any one of my colleagues that's going to be in the field this summer, me included. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's something to write a paper on. I don't know.
It might be.
So with that, I think there are no more questions come in now. So we're going to thank you, Peir. Thank you so much for that presentation. Hopefully everyone's feeling inspired to go and get your papers sorted and go through some reviews if you have any in the inbox.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was an absolute pleasure. And I encourage the gang and anybody else that might view this video online to, if you've got questions, reach out to either me or one of the other CEs. If you've got questions specific to sedimentology, our door's always open and we welcome those questions.
Absolutely. And any more general questions as well, we have the Seds Online Forums too. So we can all learn. We can all learn from each other.
Absolutely.
So join us again next week for our webinar, and we're going to be having Professor Charlie Bristow coming in from Birkbeck University of London, who's going to talk to us about virtual graphic logs in their applications for teaching and research. So anyone who is planning teaching for next semester already, this is something that you should come along to as well. And of course, there's the research element too. Between now and then, we have 5 coffee breaks all around the world in different zones. So if you haven't been along to our coffee breaks yet, come along, check it out. And there will be one somewhere near you in the zones. Check out the webpage and you can find out more there. But I think I'll close it there and say thank you very much to you, Peir.
Yeah, absolutely my pleasure. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye now.